heart rate rose above 120 when you seemed to be inactive for 10 minutes before starting at that time. I was like, well.
Hey, welcome back to Budget Outlaws. Well, we finally made it out to the track, and it was a mixture of good and bad, let's just put it that way. And so the car performed well, but it has some issues, and well, we got to make some changes. So stay tuned, and we'll start with some good stuff, and then we'll go to the bad stuff. These are probably the only two I'll ever use. So this one is a 4.5 pound, and if I later decide to go to 10.5, I could do that. That's the next jump up, or so 4, 6, 10.5. So, anyways, that's what we're going to today. The two springs can be more than doubled by the boost controller by applying pressure to the top and the bottom port on the so this one is below the diaphragm, this one's above the diaphragm, so it can go back and forth by applying pressure to make it seem like there's a bigger spring in there, and that will keep it the wastegate closed longer. So for right now, I just want to put the 4.5 in there just so I can make sure I can control it. And I have a feeling from the last video that boost leak was actually saving my butt. And so I may have to implement a controlled boost leak to be able to drive this thing until I can redesign the wastegate. This hole is a boost leak. And in our first track day, I could never get it to boost more than about 2 or 3 pounds. And so therefore, that is a restriction. So I added this the second day, and the second day it was going nuts out. And in fact, before the first track day, I could never get more than 4 psi out of it, and that was manual boost controller and all that stuff. So let's humor me a little bit, but a portion of this boost leak might be my temporary solution. All right, so here's what I came up for: a controlled boost leak, somewhat controlled. And it may need to go bigger. I may have to go more of a leak. So I took a bolt and I drilled a slot in it. So that will allow boost air to leak out. And depending on how much I screw it in is how much it closes it off. So if I leave it just a few threads out, it should get, you know, as much as it's going to float with it as it's currently made. And that just might be enough to have some sort of control over it. So something like that. And I'll have to put some thread locker on it just to keep it from rattling out. And changing my boost on the fly. For oiling, I had a container box that I added to catch the oil out of the bottom of the turbo. Thanks Mike from 2014 Outlaws on Facebook. He's a friend of ours. So then the sump pump would pull from that. So the fix this time will be to add a Turbo Smart oil pressure regulator that will keep the pressure to a max of 40 psi. When I did overboost and start smoking, I could basically keep it less than 45 psi and it would clear out pretty quickly. It is OPR, oil pressure regulator. T40 is what they're calling it. So basically this line comes from the engine, one of the ports on the oil pressure sender or something like that, like a T. Mine is off of a Bling filter adapter. So this comes in from there. It gets regulated down to 40 psi. Then it goes into the turbo. But before it hits that, it gets to a 0.065 restrictor. I'll show you a picture of that. And just for my peace of mind, I got a gauge there for pressure regulator. And we'll get an idea of what it is under boost, which is the main issue. And then the bottom is a 6AN return line. So here's our drain catch, our turbo oil drain catch can. So what we're doing is right off the bottom of the turbo, we've got a 3/4 inch nipple off the bottom of the turbo, then a 3/4 inch hose going into a 3/4 inch fitting, and so it'll drain and it'll come out the bottom here. This is an old catch can that I've gutted, so now it's basically, there's no baffles in it, so that's not an issue. This other fitting is a return line for the Turbo Smart turbo oil pressure regulator, something like that. Anyways, that will be the other addition to this fix in a minute. Okay, so that's kind of where it's going to set, and it's tilted down a little more than I probably would have liked, but I'll get that hooked up and tighten up the hose. Let's do the hose first. That's going to be the tight one. So let me go over it real quick. We've got the inlet. This is the inlet from the main tank sitting above this line. So the inlet, the main tank has two outlets, and I'll show you a picture of those in another shot. And then those two outlets are 3/8 lines, and they'll feed into this T. So I'll have a pretty good supply of gas going into it, going through a 100 micron filter and into a surge tank. So now the surge tank is filling up and it's full, and then we run the pumps, and the pumps pump out, and they go, each of them, into this Y up here, which is, these are 8s, 8 AN, this is a 10 AN. They go into the aeromotive, and it carries on and goes out to the engine on this end. So the return for the aeromotive, this is the aeromotive fuel regulator, so the return for the aeromotive goes back into the surge tank, which for the most part is going to keep that surge tank full, because it's not going to need all that gas. So then where does that gas go when it's full? So it goes out this return, and it goes back into the top of the tank, which is I'll show you that in a second. Another shot. That's the other part of the tank work that we did. So that's kind of it. It's fairly simple, if indeed the return works
if it doesn't need check valves, or like my question is what happens if one of these pumps quits working? Does it just pump back the other direction and not go through to the engine? So that is one question that I have. I probably have lots of questions at this point. You should see all the spare parts that I'm not using. So this was not a budget job, although someone else could buy this fairly cheap. This was $112 and included 2 of these pumps. And one of them I'm not even going to use. I'm using an original Bosch pump versus the Chinese pump. So they both sound good. I tested them. They seem to be working all right. But I will have this Bosch pump, this Chinese pump, and you know, a couple filters. The air motive is a reuse from the old system. We will be adding a boost reference so that we can tell, or so that the system will know when it's getting boost, and it'll raise the pressure on this 1 psi per 1 psi of boost. So let's assume right now it's at 43 psi. So if I get 3 psi, I would go to 46, and that might be okay. I probably will look to raising it up to 58, which is what Chevrolet decided was good at the time. I think some systems actually came 43, and that's why they lowered it. I don't know why they lowered it to 43. All right, so the last bit of that is the injectors and the lines coming to the engine. This line is an AN8, and I'd love to have an AN10, but it's quite a job to change that line out. It is already braided AN line, so it's a good line, it's a good setup, and it goes through another filter that's close up to the engine. So it gives us a 30 hot going to both relays directly from the battery. And then we're going to use the yellow and the blue signal as signal wires. I used to run the fuel pump. So it's actually going through 2 relays, which I'm going to see if I can eliminate the first relay. See if it does anything else besides this. But for now, this will work. So the last wire in the relay is a 10 gauge wire going to the fuel pump itself and to the positive side of that. Then the next, for the fuel pump end, then we need just a ground wire. So we're doing a 10 gauge ground wire directly over to the battery just to make it as efficient as possible. And I used the same red and white 10 gauge wire, so I ended up marking it up and shrink wrap all over, but it worked. So then we're going to check it out for leaks and see if it's giving us any problem there. And yeah, there was a little bit of issue there. We need to correct the gauge. The gauge itself wasn't screwed in properly. So, but all the fittings seem to be holding, which is just like a miracle because there's so many of them. Didn't anticipate a problem starting it because we didn't change the fuel pressure or any of that kind of settings. So it started up, ran fine, no leaks. It was amazing.
Woo! 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 It's stinky!
Well, I had to start it up for the ladies and do a little burnout. And, you know, once again, it worked really well. I had a flat tire, so I couldn't get any kind of burnout going. But next time I'll have the line lock going, and it'll actually do a proper burnout. You can see it on the flat tires on the right side, and it just wore the 2 outer edges of the tire. And it's on a slant anyway. So anyways, we had a good time. It works, and I'm really happy. Injectors are next. Join us for that. It's going to be good.